俺はアレス・ロビナ。新しい時代でも同じ願いを持って共に戦えるといいな。仲間と団結して人々の夢を叶えるためにはラングリッサーの力が必要なんだ。俺を信じてくれ。平和な日々を壊した奴らを俺は絶対に許さない。
Hey everyone, this is Nitro. In this video, I'm going to talk about the more powerful character that is supposed to be released with the June 4th update, which is Aries. Okay, so Aries is a character who is considered absolutely top tier for PvP, and because of that, I am going to have a lot of example battles at the end of this video to hopefully demonstrate both his pros and cons, because I think people have been focusing primarily on his pros without realizing that he does have some weaknesses and vulnerabilities. So in any case though, that will be covered in that section, the battle examples. So here I'm just going to start by giving an overview of Aries. So Aries is part of the protagonist faction, he's part of the Empire faction, and he's part of his new own faction where he is the faction buffer, okay? His talent is Fearless Will, and it has two primary effects. The first effect is that for every enemy within 1, 2, or 3 spaces, all stats except for hit points are increased by a certain percentage, with a maximum percentage increase of 20% at 6 stars. Okay. The second effect is that when moving, he is able to ignore enemy unit obstruction, so he's able to just move right through them if he has enough mobility. In addition to that, before dealing damage or when ending a turn, for every enemy Aries walks through, he gains 1 siege formation buff. And the siege formation buff has an effect of increasing his crit rate by 5, 6, 7, or 8%. This buff can be stacked up to 5 times if he can move through 5 enemies. Okay. And finally, if a crit occurs this turn, all siege formation effects will be cleared at the end of the turn. Okay. So he can steadily kind of stack up these buffs theoretically, getting up to 5 of them before launching an AoE attack, but realistically you're not going to do that, okay? It's the secondary effect is just a nice effect of having a higher crit chance to do more damage to the enemies, okay? So, next, let's talk about his bond requirements. So, Aries does need Maya. Just like how Maya needs Aries, Aries needs Maya, okay? And Aries needs Maya for his 4th bond, his defense bond. For his 5th and final bond, he needs Bozo, okay? In terms of maximum stats, okay? The Dragon Master has more attack, roughly 32 more attack at 599 attack, and the Dragon Master also has, of course, less hit points as a result, okay? It also has a bit less defense, more magic defense, and more skill, But the primary thing is the attack comparison, right? It's 599 attack for the Dragon Master and 567 attack for the infantry class, the Emperor class. Now, what I should mention here is 599 attack is quite high, but keep in mind that this is all relative. Like, for example, Leon, the mightiest knight, of course, Leon has 620 attack in his Strike Master class, right? So Aries has 599 attack, so it is 21 attack lower than Leon, just for comparison purposes. Alright, so finally, we talk about Aries' soldier boost, right? And Aries' soldier boost is 15% hit points, 40% attack, 30% defense, and 15% magic defense. In other words, this is very much an offensively oriented soldier boost, right? His soldiers gets the maximum 40% attack increase. And you can also say his talent, Fearless Will, can also give him additional attack, right? Because all stats are increased. So, potentially, there is 60% attack increase for Aries' soldiers, right? Next, let's talk about the heart bond of Aries. So, Aries should primarily be used in his Dragon Master class for maximum mobility, although the Emperor class may have utility in PvE content. I should mention that. But primarily, everyone will use it in this Dragon Master class, and the Dragon Master bonds will be that at level 4, when unit hit points is less than 70%, damage taken is reduced by 10%. At level 7, when unit hit points is less than 70%, damage increases by 10% in battle. And at level 10, of course, the usual all hero stats is increased by 5%. For the Emperor class, at level 4, when unit hit points is greater than 80%, your crit strike rate is reduced by 10%. So what that means is the chance of you getting crit hit is reduced by 10%. At level 7, when you're attacked, the crit strike damage is increased by 10%. So what that means is as long as you crit hit the enemy, you do 10% increased damage with that crit hit. And then at level 10, of course, all hero stats plus 5. The Dragon Master bonds are basically garbage, right? You have to be below 70% hit points for them to take into effect. You should never be really attacking when you're at less than 70% hit points. So it's effectively almost meaningless, okay? The Emperor bonds are more likely to take into effect, but they affect the crit rate, which is kind of weird, okay? I've actually never seen bonds that affect crit rate like this, at least not to my knowledge. So it is what it is. I mean, something is better than nothing, I suppose, but ultimately, the bonds-wise, Aries is not that great. But with that said, he doesn't need to have great bonds, because his talent and everything else makes up for it. Next up is the useful skills of Aries. And the useful skills of Aries, there are quite a few of them. The most useful, of course, is Aries' Awakening skill, his 3C. And because he's released in June, just like Maya, he gets to start with his 3C, just like all future heroes. Okay, so Aries' 3C is called Fearless Hurricane, and it's actually a self-buffing skill. Okay, it's an active use effect where the unit gains Fearless Hurricane buff. The effect of that is after dealing damage, you cause all enemies within 2 rings of you to be transferred beside this unit and deal 1 ring of 0.15 times AoE damage to them. In addition, if the unit has the siege formation effect, the character can move 4 blocks afterwards. This buff lasts 1 turn. In addition to that, the unit also gains plus 20% attack, Ride the Wind buff, and Reinforcements buff, and these buffs last 2 turns each. Finally, after use, the character may move again with the remaining movement the character has, plus 4. But it can only move in straight lines. So this can be relatively confusing because there's just so many effects to it, okay? So let me just break it down one by one, okay? First of all, so Fearless Hurricane has the effect of after you deal damage, you can do AoE damage to the enemies, 0.15 times damage, okay? Secondly, if there is a siege formation effect on the character, so if Aries has moved through an enemy before using this skill, then the character can move 4 blocks after the AoE strike. Third, once the skill has been used, Aries gets plus 20% attack, gets Ride the Wind buff, and gets the Reinforcements buff. And all of these 3 buffs last 2 turns each. So in some ways you can say this almost acts like a self-faction buff because he already gets plus 20% attack. Finally, after using this skill, the character is allowed to move with any remaining movement and add 4 additional movement to that, but he can only move in straight lines. So for example, if he uses the buff all the way at the back, he would have, and right at the start of the turn, he would have his base 5 mobility plus 4 mobility for a total of 9 mobility to start that turn. So this extremely high mobility allows Aries to basically strike any enemy at will. And that's why Aries is considered top tier for PvP, right? Zerida can move 7 tiles and then attack 2 tiles, right? Aries can move 9 tiles and attack. So he basically pretty much has more range than Zerida, really, right? Because Zerida has 7 tiles plus 2 for a total of 9 tiles in terms of range. Aries can move 9 tiles and have 1 additional range for his attack, giving him basically 10 range. So Aries is pretty darn nasty, okay? In addition to Fearless Hurricane, Aries has Wind Whisper, which is pretty much the standard AoE skill. We've seen it on Shuri and so on. What it does is 0.3 times AoE damage to enemies within 1 block of him. And a random debuff is applied to each target he strikes with the AoE. Okay. By itself, Wind Whisper tends to be a terrible AoE skill. But keep in mind that Aries also has the Fearless Hurricane AoE damage of 0.15 times. In other words, Aries can do 0.45 times AoE damage to enemies, which is actually pretty good. Okay. Keep in mind though that Leonhard does 0.55 times AoE damage, right? Leonhard with a Fear of Fire Machete, with Fusion Dark Emperor Sword, and then he also has his Instant Transfer AoE as well, which is I think 0.1 times or something like that. So actually, Leonhard gets a lot more AoE damage output than Aries does, but Leonhard has much less mobility first of all. And yeah, so that's really the difference. Okay, so you should not expect Aries AoE to be able to one-shot anything the way Leonhard did in Season 1. But the combination of Aries' AoE with maybe another weakening attack from another character should be able to kill off something. Okay, so 2 AoEs would be able to kill off the target, although not necessarily just 1. So that would be one combo. Fearless Hurricane with Wind Whisper, and then a 1-point skill. Right? The other combo of Aries is to make him a single target striker. And usually, in that case, you would run his Majestic Charge skill. Right? So Majestic Charge has the effect of dealing 1.4 times damage, which is actually fairly low for a 5 cooldown skill. But the special effect of it is that before battle begins, you dispel 3 buffs from the target. And before battle, for every 1 enemy within 2 rings of him, crit rate is increased by 8%, up to a 32% crit rate increase. And finally, if this attack kills off the target, cooldown of Majestic Charge is reduced by 3, so that it turns into a 2-turn cooldown skill. So, what this skill can do, in other words, is if let's say the enemy juggler doesn't have a faction buff and activates Triton, Majestic Charge can completely remove the Triton buff, right? By dispelling 3 buffs from the target. And that gives Aries the chance of potentially one-shotting an enemy juggler. So that is why a single target strike Aries could be very, very deadly. Because once again, he has 10 range, right? 9 mobility plus the Majestic Charge attack. Okay. Finally, in terms of 1-point skills that Aries may bring, the most common one is Rising Gale, which is the 1-point passive. It has an effect of increasing his crit rate by 10%, and if the unit has Siege Formation effect after dealing damage, he may gain an additional 4 blocks of movement. This move again effect has a 1-turn cooldown. Okay, you're mainly bringing the skill for the crit rate increase of 10%. Okay, because generally speaking, when you attack the enemy, and you will likely crit hit the enemy, and if you crit hit the enemy, you lose those Siege Formation buffs, so you won't have them. So you won't gain that 4 blocks of movement afterwards. But if you fail to crit hit the enemy, you may get that 4 additional movement to be able to retreat quite a bit, right? So that's why usually Rising Gale is the skill that is brought. Okay. Of course, other than Rising Gale, you may consider bringing the Resist skill, and the reason for Resist is primarily to buff up someone else, right? It allows another character to get magic defense of 30% increase, immunity to stun, immunity cannot be buffed, and immunity to mobility reduction effects. And it lasts 2 turns. So, maybe you have Juggler as in your party, and your opponent brings, I don't know, Leon or something, right? Leon can apply mobility reduction effects on your Juggler, so maybe Resist might be worth bringing in that situation over Rising Gale. That's just a thought. It's not. As I said, in general, people bring Rising Gale, but Resist could be an option depending on the situation. Won't be very often, but could be used. Other than those 5 useful skills, here are the remaining skills that Aries gets access to. I wanted to display these skills because a lot of these skills actually have use in PvE content, although they're effectively useless for PvP, right? For example, the first skill is Aries' faction buff, Prophecy of Reincarnation, right? So all allied Fantasy Reincarnation characters receive a faction buff effect, as well as damage dealt is increased by 5% for every enemy within 3 spaces, up to a 20% damage increase. So not much else to say about this faction buff. It's a solid one, it does the usual faction buff effect and can also increase damage. The reason you generally don't bring the faction buff is because Aries' 3C generally needs to be brought for that mobility buff. So that's why it's not a very common skill. I would say almost never for PvP, but in PvE content you may consider bringing it. Right? The second skill that's maybe useful amongst his other skills is Roar. Right? Roar is your standard, buff dispelling attack skill, and with Roar in his infantry class, for example, Aries may be a good character to use against the Thunder Dragon if you don't have Elwyn or whatever, right? Because in that case, Aries can actually bring Roar, and he can also bring his Majestic Charge, both of which can dispel buffs from the Thunder Dragon. So this would be for newer players in this sense, but, and maybe there may be challenges where you need multiple dispel skills, so Roar would have a use there too. Okay. Third skill that Aries has access to is Lightning. Not much needs to be said. Cherie uses Lightning to pretty much wipe out everything constantly, dealing 1.5 times damage. Aries can do the same thing, right? So it can be a very useful PvE skill. Aries has a 1-point skill Reinforcements, same as Cherie. The reason why Reinforcements is placed in the other skill section is because Aries' 3C gives the Reinforcement buff for 2 turns. Given that's the case, you don't need to bring a 1-point Reinforcement skill. You're better off bringing another 1-point skill. But once again, in PvE content, I don't know, you might actually want to bring Reinforcements. Last but not least, Aries' most useless skill is Sunshade, right? It's the passive that has a 30% chance of recovering 30% hit points. 30% chance is incredibly low, it's just not worth it compared to all the other 1-point skills that Aries has access to. So moving on, Hero Awakening materials required for Aries, okay? As always, just like any other hero, you're going to need 5 Splendid Stardust and 5 Eternal Moon Splendors to do Awakening, right? But other than that, the Awakening materials Aries needs for his first Awakening is 8 Life Crystals and 8 Barrier Crystals, right? So the green ones and the red ones. For the second Awakening, he needs 12 Monsoon Hearts and 12 Pure Molten Hearts. So, once again, if you plan to build Aries, start gathering these materials now, in preparation. So, what is next then is talk about the soldiers that Aries gets access to. So just like Maya, Aries has access to 7 different soldiers, and 3 of them are infantry class, 2 of them are cavalry class, and 2 of them are flyers. Okay, so Steel-Winged Warriors and Angels are his flyer soldiers, Heaven's Guard and Heavy Cavalry are his cavalry soldiers, and the 3 infantry soldiers he has is Berserkers, Masked Maids, and Heavy Infantry. Okay. So I've put the infantry class soldiers into the other section right away, simply because I generally consider Aries to be a flyer class character and not to be an infantry class character. So that's why they went into the other section. But, the infantry soldiers may have use if you use an infantry Aries for PvE content. In that case, either Masked Maids or Heavy Infantry could both work, Berserkers, I believe only people who have Lanford build would have Berserkers upgraded in the first place, so I generally neglect them. But, Berserkers have the crit hit chance increase or whatever, so they might have a use for him too. I really don't know. This is much more iffy to me about Berserkers. I know next to nothing about them. Moving on, okay? So, because Aries is a flyer class, by default, you generally want to use flyer soldiers on him. It's that simple. Why would you make your flying character be limited to cavalry mobility type, which is terrible for moving across terrain, right? So effectively, in my opinion, Aries really just has 2 soldier choices, Steel-Winged Warriors and Angels. Heaven's Guard are possible in the very rare situation. Maybe, for example, you're using Aries with Luna, and you want Luna's Wind God Realm to affect Aries. In that case, Heaven's Guard, with their 45% attack increase and being a land-based soldier, could work out. Now, that's a very rare situation. As for Heavy Cavalry are garbage, right? They just increase attack by 20%. Nobody should have them leveled up, so they're truly garbage. So ultimately, the 2 soldiers, though, in general, for almost all utility is really just angels and steel-winged warriors. And generally speaking, steel-winged warriors would be the superior soldier overall because they provide a 30% attack increase when attacking. By comparison, angels only have a 20% attack and defense increase, right? That's just a general utility. Like for PvP, it should 100% be steel-winged warriors, okay? But there may be situations where you want angels because angels have that 45% magic damage reduction. So once again, in PvE content, in certain circumstances, you might want angels over steel-winged warriors. But in general, I would say 90% of the time, you would want steel-winged warriors over angels. The only exception to that is if you have level 10 angels and you don't have level 10 steel-winged warriors yet, right? But given all the characters that can use steel-winged warriors, like, Lanford, like Elwyn, there's a whole bunch of other heroes that can use steel-winged warriors as their soldiers. You should really have them leveled up, right? And so finally, we move on to talk about equipment for Aries, okay? So Aries' equipment really does kind of depend on whether you're using him as an AoE attacker or a single target striker. And really also what gear you have available to you. His best weapon, for sure, without doubt, is the Bloody Death, right? And the reason why that's his best weapon is because that is a new weapon that has actually not been released on International yet. As a side note, it should be coming with the Record of Lodos War equipment banner. But the effect of it is that first, it increases attack by 10%, and secondly, before actively dealing damage, if the enemy's hit points is less than 100%, your damage is increased by 5%, and after actively dealing damage, you deal fixed damage to the enemy equals to 0.5 times of your attack. The thing about Bloody Death is that the effects, the secondary effect, the fixed damage, kicks in with AoE attacks. Okay? Because it kicks in with AoE attacks as well as single target strikes, that's what makes it his best weapon. So Wind Whisper and his other AoE can trigger that Bloody Death fixed damage effect, making it quite powerful for him. Okay? Lacerates and King's Crown, that's best equipment for flyers in general. Not much else needs to be said about that. Okay? And then as for the accessory choice, generally speaking, his best accessory is considered to be the Judge's Talisman because it can do additional damage to holy class characters, right? Given you're using AoEs and so on, doing 12% additional damage to holy class characters is always a nice bonus. Okay. So that would be the best gear overall, especially for Aries that is focused on AoE strikes, right? But not every Aries uses AoE strikes, right? We all know that. So if you plan to use Aries heavily for single target strikes, Ragnarok, right? Last Rites, King's Crown, and Lone Star Armlet. Okay, Lone Star Armlet because it gives the most attack increase overall, 10% attack and 10% defense increase, as opposed to, let's say, the Judge's Talisman that only gives 8% attack increase. It's only a 2% difference, but still, every bit helps, right? And Ragnarok because of fixed damage before combat, weakens the enemy so you can do more damage. So that would be the best gear and the secondary gear. Both sets are quite viable for him. As for other gear, at this point, other gear can be just anything. I just threw in a set of gear that's pretty common, like Devil's Axe, Gargoyle Jacket, Jormungandr's Eye, and Slayer's Emblem as alternatives. But it can really be anything. You can have the weapon as Peacemaker. You can have another armor. You can have another helmet. You can have any other attack accessory for him in the other gear section. If you don't have access to Lacerates and King's Crown, it's kind of whatever at that point, really. So that would be best gear. And his enchant should 100% be Full Moon. Okay. In general, that's considered his best enchant. The reason for Full Moon is because it gives 10% increase to all stats. That kicks in for both AoE attacks and single target strikes, making it, without doubt, his best enchant, right? Can you consider using Breeze? Of course, right? Because technically, he could have Breeze for the +2 mobility and benefit from that for attacking. So the whole issue, the reason you don't need Breeze for Aries, though, is because that is seriously overkill. Aries already has 10 mobility. Do you really need 9 mobility? 5 mobility plus 4 mobility with his 3C, right? So 9 mobility. Do you really need 11 mobility to attack the enemies? I mean, I don't think so. So that's why I would say his best gear is Full Moon. You know, more stats means more damage overall, as opposed to, you know, Breeze for 2 mobility and 10% extra damage, which is the Breeze enchant. Okay, so with this gear coverage, we've now talked about everything about Aries, and now I'm going to move on to talk about example battles of Aries in action, both when he dominates as well as situations where he fails to dominate. Okay, so here we go. For this first example, I'm going to take an example from the Chinese iOS server Season 4 Apex Playoffs, the finals match. Okay, and in this battle, player 1 has Gizerov with Bozel, Liana, Landius, and Yusuke. Player 2 has a much more offensively oriented team, bringing Aries, bringing Claret, bringing Landius, Weiler, and Yusuke. Right? So, turn 1 was already done, where the characters were just initially setting up, getting faction buffed, and so on. And on turn 2, player 2 goes on the offensive. So, initial setup continues, right? Activating buffs, blah blah blah. And now the slow approach begins, maneuvering a little bit forward. And activating the faction buff to buff up all the characters. So now everyone is pretty much ready to go. They got all their buffs, right? The Yusuke's are ready to attack. And now Weiler activates high stakes. So player 2 takes the offensive at this point. Claret runs forward and attacks. The first strike, right, does not kill Landius, but Claret gets to act again. And with the second strike, with Roar, Claret hits Landius and finishes him off. Landius revives, and now Aries activates his 3C, runs forward, and uses the single target strike. Now, I should mention that this Aries seems to have Ragnarok, but the Landius here has Swordsmith Metal. So the Ragnarok didn't do any damage to Landius. Okay. So the attack occurs. Landius survives this attack with 310 hit points. But Aries' AoE does enough damage to finish off Landius. So, with a Claret Aries assault, both characters were able to kill off Landius once and cause Landius to die. So it turned into a 5v4 just like that. The interesting thing about this battle is that player 1 actually won this fight. Okay. He was able to crush both Claret and Aries while the remaining 3 characters of player 2 were not in the fight. And eventually, the battle turned into Gizerov against Yusuke. And Gizerov was actually able to beat Yusuke by using the summon to do damage. So this was a very interesting fight. And unexpectedly, the victor was actually player 1. But nonetheless, this Aries Claret assault just shows how Aries, in the single target strike mode, can be a complete tank buster. The second battle of the same finals match actually had both sides bring Aries to this battle. So player 1, who lost the first match, as I mentioned, is trying to approach and take over the center. Player 2 is hanging back initially. So both sides activate Tranquility, and now Zerda begins activating her Bloodthirster to be ready to assassinate an enemy. Meanwhile, Yusuke activates his faction buff, followed by his Spiritual Outbreak skill. So now, player 2 begins the assault yet again, and he launches an AoE attack with Reed. to start to damage all these enemies. Okay? So all these enemies have gotten various debuffs as a result, and now player 1 activates high stakes. To counter that, player 2 now activates his Aries, charges all the way up, and launches Wind Whisper. The Wind Whisper AoE was already able to kill off the damaged Aries of player 1. Okay. Next, he activates his Bloody Death for fixed damage. So this Bozal and this Landius both have swordsmith medals, so they were immune to the fixed damage. But Yusuke took some. In addition, because the other effect is to teleport all enemies within 2 rings to him, Wilder was actually within 2 rings, right? 1 ring, 2 rings. She was in this forest tile. So Wilder is teleported into range. The 3C AoE damage of 0.15 times damage is applied. And now Wilder dies. And in fact, Bozal is left barely alive. In fact, you can say if this Bozal did not have a swordsman medal, he was dead too. To the Bloody Death AoE damage, to the Bloody Death fixed damage. So just like that, this Aries with his AoE strike took out Wilder, took out the enemy Aries, and would have taken out this Bozal if it did not have a swordsmith medal. So it shows just how powerful Aries can be with AoE attacks. This is purely an AoE attack Aries with 1758 attack. And via Wind Whisper, via his 3C AoE, via Bloody Death, was able to just completely annihilate player 1's party, right? It's now 5 characters against 3, and the battle is all but over. The one other thing I should mention that was very interesting about this finals fight though, is that Aries here actually brought the guard skill, the 1-point guard skill, because guard can allow characters to be immune to cannot be healed effects. That skill helped player 2 protect Landius against Yusuke, so that this Landius was able to not get the cannot be healed effect on him, which actually ultimately won player 2 the match. Since the rest of this match is fairly interesting, but also relatively short, I'll just let it play out so that you guys can watch the remaining parts of this match. Yusuke now finishes off Aries. It is now 2 against 3. Landius aggressively attacks against the enemy Landius, and Aries is here to just mass heal and keep everyone healthy. Now here, Yusuke uses Dark Tincture against the enemy Landius. It fails to kill, and also fails to apply cannot be healed, because Aries had previously used the guard skill on Landius. So this Aries ran guard, heal, and mass heal as a dedicated healer. And because Landius was able to heal and could not be killed, player 1 no longer has a win condition. So at this point, player 1 simply retreats, right? If Dark Tincture had applied cannot be healed on Landius there just now, then it would have been a completely different fight. because between Landius' first strike and then, between Yusuke's first strike, then Landius' follow-up, the enemy Landius would have died for the first time, right? Then the next turn, he could finish off the enemy Landius, and then have the other character attack Zerda. So without running Aries so defensively, bringing heal, mass heal, and the shield skill, player 2 would have actually, it's very likely player 2 would have lost this fight. Choosing to bring shield rather than, let's say, miracle or attack blessing was what actually won player 2 this battle. So it was a perfect selection of skills for this fight. So now that we showed two examples of Aries being successful, right, as a single target striker and then as an AoE striker, let's show an example of Aries where he is not successful, okay? And in this example, it is a 5-star Aries against a 6-star juggler, okay? So Aries runs forward, uses his 3C, moves through the enemies, and launches his special skill, right? Dispelling 3 buffs from Juggler. The 3 buffs that are dispelled removes all buffs from this Juggler. But do note that this Juggler had an immunity pop-up, which means this Aries has a Ragnarok, which failed to do fixed damage to the enemy before combat. Right? So it was immune to the... And what happened there just now was Juggler survived with 3737 hit points. Let me just go back a few steps. So there we go. Now, the reason it's also survived, of course, is because Aries failed to crit hit with this strike. So, by failing to crit hit, there was not enough damage to one-shot this Juggler. But it is telling, and it should be noted, that if Aries fails to crit hit, this can happen, right? You can fail to one-shot the enemy tank, even though this is a Juggler without Triton up. So, with that failure, right, the AoE strike would not kill anyone, and in fact, Juggler would start healing up the allies a bit. So, in other words, Aries is now stuck in the middle of all these opponents and is an easy kill. So, with this failure, player 2 has lost this match completely. So, after the unsuccessful example, let's show another example of Aries in action being successful, but in a different way. And here, Aries' versatility is shown because he is going to pretty much break up the enemy formation. So, here we go. So, what is being done here is player 1 has his Landius with the faction buff and the 3C skill active, so he's guarding everyone. And thus, Luna is going to activate Wind God Realm to allow other characters to start maneuvering forward. In response, player 2 has Aries use his 3C and rush forward. And he rushes so far, he can charge past Luna and charge past even the enemy Leonhard. And by moving to this tile here, which is below Rachel and to the left of the enemy Leonhard, he's within 2 blocks of everybody but Luna, who had activated Wind God Realm already. So, AoE attack of Wind Whisper hits these 3 characters. The teleport of the characters within 2 blocks of him, they're now moved all around him, and the Landius is no longer guarding Luna. And AoE damage has ripped up the enemy quite significantly. Although, in this case, Aries did not kill anyone. Rachel survived, Bozo survived, Leonhard survived. So, as I mentioned before, right, you should not expect Aries' AoE to be able to one-shot enemy characters in general, at least not at the top level. But the formation break here is important. So, enemy starts attacking Aries to get rid of him, but in the meantime, player 2 now has a free opportunity to attack and kill off the opponent's Luna. Right? And just like that, the formation and strategy of player 1 has been broken. yes, Aries is going to die, so in some ways you can say it's a trade of Aries for killing Luna. But at the same time, look at all the characters of player 2, or sorry, of player 1. They're all now in the far back, and most of them are quite heavily damaged. So the battle will continue, but once again, this just shows yet another ability of Aries in terms of, breaking the enemy's plans and strategies and giving you an advantage in attacking. So this next example is another battle where Aries failed, and it's going to be player 1 bringing Angelina, Luna, Olivier, Lana, and Chloe against a much more traditional team of Aries, Imelda, Juggler, Liana, and actually Sakura. So let's get started here. Alright, so player 1 does the initial setup on the left side, and player 2 has Imelda use the 3C on Aries to buff up his mobility. Meanwhile, player 1 is just setting up his characters, getting the princess party up and running. And player 2 now has Juggler teleport himself forward to be a tank in the center of the map, seizing map control and doing some AoE damage to start. Meanwhile, player 1 has Olivier provide some healing initially. And Chloe moves up and launches a discipline attack to start on Juggler to weaken him dramatically. And provide healing, of course. So now, player 2 activates Act Again on Sakura, and in response, Angelina uses her 3C to knock Sakura back, and actually throws her too. So now Aries uses his 3C, charges forward, single target strikes Lana, and kills her off. Also does some AoE damage to the remaining characters. And then he gets to retreat into Juggler's guard range. So now Angelina finishes off Sakura, who was frozen last turn. And Aries, who was damaged, attacks Chloe, but actually fails to kill Chloe in one shot, right? So Chloe barely survived, but Highland Warriors having that damage reduction and Chloe being tough enough managed to live. And this is a very, very powerful Aries too, right? Keep in mind. So Chloe tanked that hit successfully, and that made all the difference. So now Chloe activates Aurora Ring to provide healing to everybody. And Liana activates Prayer to heal up Aries, but Aries is not brought to full health. So now Olivier, Archer class, keep in mind, aims up, launches his AoE attack, and Aries is killed in one shot. Right? The Archer advantage against Aries, right, doing extra damage, caused this damaged Aries to die to the AoE strike. And at this point, it is 4 characters against 3. And player 2 has no damage dealers anymore, right? I suppose Imelda can be a damage dealer, but there's Juggler, Liana, and Imelda against 4 characters. So at this point, the battle is basically all but over. Imelda manages to kill off Angelina. So next, new turn, Chloe attacks Juggler and finishes him off. So back to 3v2. Imelda attacks Olivier, doesn't really work out, they both live. And Luna kills off Liana, who was previously damaged already. So now it's 3 against 1, and so player 2 surrenders at this point, ending the battle. The last battle I'm going to demonstrate is going to be an Aries against Aries match. So both sides have Aries, although player 1 has a different party with Landius, Listel, Liana, and Angelina, while player 2 has a party with Juggler, Yusuke, Liana, and Zerida. Okay, so relatively, I mean, they both have tanks, they both have Liana, you know, it's relatively similar. So early on, both sides are just setting up and getting ready for combat. You know, tanks activate their guard skills and faction buffs, you know. So this battle will be determined really by who uses their Aries better. So at this point, setup is mostly complete, right? Gospel is used on tanks to protect against, let's say, Listel debuffs and so on. So both sides are now starting to maneuver forward, bit by bit. Okay. So Yusuke moves up, activates his Eruption skill. And now Listel moves up and uses Reaper's Touch on the enemy Yusuke. Right? And actually silences him and applies all those debuffing effects. So player 2 now has Aries charge forward with his 3C and Wind Whisper. So everyone is in range of this 3C. So they all get teleported back. The second AoE hits, and it's important to note that nobody dies. Right? Everyone gets heavily damaged, but nobody actually dies to that AoE. So player 1 now focuses on healing up his party. You know, his Aries is brought back to full health. And player 2 activates his Zerida. In fact, again. So now player 1 sends his Aries forward now with the 3C and launches Wind Whisper as well. And this Wind Whisper instantly killed off Yusuke because Yusuke was previously damaged by Listel. So whereas player 2 had sent Aries in without having done any damage previously, player 1 sent his Aries in against a damaged target and was able to kill it off as a result. So at this point, you know, the battle is massively in favor of player 1, pretty much. You know, the battle will continue on, but you know, both sides are going to lose their Aries, or should lose their Aries at this point. But once again, player 1 has lost nobody, whereas player 2 has already lost their Yusuke. So, you know, battle's all but over at this point. So this is a clear example of where proper use of Aries made all the difference. So thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you found this video useful to you overall. You know, I tried to show some of the strengths of Aries, how to use him, as well as potential weaknesses. And on that note, Nitro out.